First of all, I'm really honored to be here and to talk with educators who are going to bring underreported global realities and creative journalistic skills to America's classrooms. I think educators are heroes, and so I'm pretty excited to be able to do this. Especially, I'm a late onset career switching journalist, so I got out of journalism school last May, and I'm turning 42 in September. And I always loved writing and talking to strangers and things when I was younger. And then in college at UC Berkeley, right before the advent of digital media, I did a lot of arts and entertainment writing for the Daily Californian student-run independent newspaper. But after that, I did pretty much every other job except for journalism, though I had like a slow trickle of freelance kind of pieces and essays and such. And ultimately, some of these jobs included, I don't know, like serving burgers and working at a performance rights organization. And finally, I ended up at the Columbia University Medical Center regulating clinical trials. And I was never going to pursue any further higher education because I actually had a master's in Pacific and International Affairs that I never really used. And I was a bit sore about that, a little ashamed. But I learned that if I had a program of interest and got in, then I could attend tuition free part time. And miraculously, that's what happened. And I did. And I entered journalism school in fall of 2020. So there was a lot going on other than the pandemic, of course, like George Floyd and hate crimes against Asian people. And then this strange juxtaposition with the mainstreaming of Korean popular content in America, which I'm Korean, so I'm the child of two Korean immigrants, and it was it was a lot, and it just made me interested in looking at stories about just Asian and Pacific Islanders in a way I hadn't before. I think before I was just sort of like, oh, I'm a well-rounded American, so just because I'm Asian, it doesn't mean that I need to always dwell on Asian issues. I know this sounds really bad, but as recently as then, I was thinking about writing about how whether the mainstreaming of Korean popular content is changing images of Asian people in the United States. And this thought went across my head, kind of like, you didn't come this far to only write about Asian issues. And I kind of heard myself thinking that for the first time. And I realized I must have grown up thinking it's a disadvantage to do this. And I just pushed through that feeling, which led me to a whole summer in Korea, working remotely, toggling with accumulated vacation. And then that led to two more summers. And this is the third, freelancing and such. And it also led me to apply to a short fellowship in global reporting at Honolulu Civil Beat, where I spent the end of last year reporting on Philippine affairs. So all of these things together sort of turned me into like a globally facing reporter, and that helped me to actually make sense of my position as like an American journalist and also an Asian person in America. And now I'm just like fully into, like, I went from wanting to be so-called well-rounded to realizing that the best thing I could probably do is specialize. And so this fall I'll be a California State Local Journalism Fellow, and I have matched with Asian American News. So I'm just really excited about that. And so I guess that you could say that like finding my vocation has been synonymous with finding my identity, which is pretty cool. So that's where I am. And so I guess I'll just launch into this. This is my project. I'm not sure if you all had a chance to see the video. It's almost 11 minutes long, but I decided I'm supposed to speak about it this whole time instead of showing the video. I was tempted to do that just to like take some of the pressure off, but this is it. Unfortunately, the link doesn't work, but this is just the beginning of the video, and the link is in the notes later if I provide the
뭐 야채, 그냥 필리핀 야채 길어왔어요. 특히 임신할 때 뭐 야채나 아니면 뭐 과일, 망고. 그러니까 우리 필리핀 여자들 임신하면 망고를 제일 길어워요, 지금. 왜냐면 밥 먹을 생각이 없으니까. 저의 한국 이름은 유정아이라고 합니다. 필리핀 이름은 페 갈로이라고. 그때 김포공항에 한 96년대 한 김포공항이 여기 우리 집이 시골까지 한 6시간이. 남편이 만나는 게 동일교회 통해서.
천진참 부모님께 경배.
이제 남편도 제가 빨리빨리 한국 사람 되려고 이제 열심히 서류를 준비하고 뭐 시험도 없고 그냥 서류만 준비했어요. 지금은 많이 어려운데 시험도 하고 뭐 인터뷰 이제 그런 거 없어요. 마리루는 동성이고 집에 가까우니까 이제 거의 가끔씩 만나는데 마리루는 농사에 너무 바빠가지고.
저는 마리로 기티kit입니다. 한국 이름은 김수용입니다.
김성국입니다. 끝났습니다. 여 동네 토백입니다. 결혼 지금 23년 차고 같이 농사 짓고 있습니다. 저희가 주로 요주나 줄콩, 오크라, 파파야, 차요테,
윙빈, 레몬그라스. 나 한국 왔을 때는 겨울이에요. 12월 달하니까 너무 추워요. 이렇게 날씨 너무 추우면은 필리핀에서 살고 싶다 그런 생각했어요.
처음에 그냥 맞선 식으로 서로 이제 했는데 이제 말이 안 통하니까 서로 손짓 발짓 해가지고
진짜 힘들었던 너무 많아요. 뭐 시부모님이랑 살면서 계속 부딪히고 우리 남편이 여기 큰아들이라서 큰아들은 한국 문화에 큰아들은 이제 부모님이 모시고 사는 게 마음이 안 맞는 것도 많고 그랬어. 그러니까 많이 힘들었어.
시작할 때 올해 하나도 없으니까 빚 받아놓고 땅 사고 하우스 만들고 뭐 그러니까 근데 이자 갚는 것도 힘들잖아요.
그때는 농사에 대한 정보가 없었거든요. 그리고 지식도 없었고 그래서 돈 된다면 무조건 심었던 거죠. 소득이 아예 없을 때는 굉장히 들어가는 건 다 들어갔는데 수확이 없으니까 굉장히 힘들거든요.
우리 아버지는 농사 잘해요. 우리 애기들 때부터는 나도 아마 7살인가 너네가요 나락 신고 장난처럼 해도 일해요. 여기는 다행이지만 장화 신고 나락 농사도 장화 신잖아요. 장갑도 쓰고 그래요. 근데 필리핀은 다 맨발하고 장갑도 안 써요. 그러니까 아버지 발도 좀 아픈 상태 그런 거 있어요. 그러니까 어린 날마다 공부 열심히 해라. 나랑 이렇게 살면 너무 힘들다 그러기도 말하고.
Sure. All right, now we're back on track. So that was a bit of video. And so my approach, when I applied to the postgraduate fellowship for the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, I almost chickened out from doing it. And then I finished the application midair on the plane to Korea because I was always already going to Korea. And I knew I was going there and I knew that there would be something important there. And I just wanted to do a story about it. It wasn't about the funding or even like the honor of it or the prestige, but I was kind of like, I know there's something important in Korea, but I kind of didn't know. So I was almost deliberately looking for something other than geopolitical tensions or something like that. That's when I saw the factoid about depopulation. I knew that Korea had a low birth rate, but usually you hear people say like, oh, so do Japan and Italy. And but that figure was really alarming about 35% of the working age people decreasing by 2030. That's really soon. It's just around the corner. And I thought that's kind of a big deal. And so originally, instead of migration in this sense, I thought of people returning to Korea who before had been exiled either during the period of colonization by Imperial Japan, and people got stuck in Sakhalin Island in Russia after World War II and for many generations and could never come back. And periodically they'd let people come back. Or I thought of overseas adoptees, so over 200,000 mostly biracial children sent all around the world because they were sort of like vestiges of the wartime, and also Korea was pretty much leveled by the war. And just sort of like these organic forces bringing people back, but also the government being more in a position to welcome people back that either they felt they couldn't take care of or actually actively rejected from being in Korea. And so I forgot about the application because it seemed pretty much beyond my control. And I went and freelanced and chased other stories. And another thing was I knew I was going to Hawaii by then. So I had never been in the Philippines before, but now I had this job lined up to report on Philippine affairs. So I thought, how am I going to do that if I haven't even set foot in the Philippines? So I negotiated for them, since I was already in Korea, to, instead of funding the round trip airfare it would have taken to bring me to Honolulu from New York City or Boston or wherever I was, to get me a round trip ticket between Korea and Philippines. This turned into something I could never have expected because, so I'll start with the approach, which I retro analyzed because I couldn't have taken these steps in order if I hadn't had these experiences. So I looked back and I did start with academics and advocates because I reached out to the Philippine Center for the Center for Philippine Studies in Honolulu. And so they're academic, and then they connected me to a professor of political science at the University of Philippines. And then she connected me to a colleague who was the only person I actually managed to meet there because of coronavirus worries and also schedules. She happened to be not only a specialist on migration of Filipino people around the world, but she was super interested in migration to Korea and marriage migration. I'd kind of heard of it, but I just thought, what? And she had all this access. So she said, I'll like connect you with a community leader, an advocate. And so now I had this idea that really fit into my accepted Pulitzer Center grant application better than anything I had thought of before. And I didn't have a lot of time left because when I returned to Korea from the Philippines, I had maybe 2 weeks left. So one thing I knew from the start, though, with populations of people, or I didn't want to be anthropological, especially because, just kind of to put it crudely, I was doing a story about potential extinction of a people and then like migration of another people and like having children and stuff. And I didn't want to be, I wanted to drill down. And so I asked myself, what do I just want to know and see? And it was very visual. I was sort of like, who are these people? Where do they live? What are their daily lives like? And what do they look like, honestly? Because I heard that from the professor of political science. She was saying, oh yeah, there are some rural areas where half the kids have Filipino mothers and they're multicultural communities. and I just couldn't even imagine it really. So that's when I knew that this should actually be a video project. And I had mostly worked in writing, and I had one introductory documentary storytelling class at journalism school, but I um, pitched the idea to Eastern Standard Times Media. And that was very deliberate too, because they're pretty new company that specializes in publishing documentary stories about the Asian region, and they're big on collaborating with local crew. And that's kind of one of the requirements. And since I was there, I mean, I'm not a Korean citizen or a Filipino person, but I was local since I was there. So they accepted it right away, and everything just lined up. Meanwhile, I talked to the community leader in Seoul, and we had this strange brunch at a weird buffet. And she was saying, I talked to the communities here, like the groups, and they don't want to. They've been burned by journalism because it just puts them in a. And I'm going out of order a little, but kind of like paints them in this sad light, and just kind of people didn't want to contribute to that anymore. They didn't want to be scooped, and I was like, oh, I understand, and I'm having a cold sweat, kind of like, if I can't talk to anybody, and then this Eastern Standard Times Media already gave me a budget and gave me a green light, and I have this grant. What am I going to really do? Like, how am I going to do this? I'm leaving Korea now in a week. But then by the end of the conversation, she just was like, oh, I know a couple, they're far from here, but they have a farm and they grow Filipino produce as well. And so I just kind of was like, that sounds amazing. I'd love to talk to her. And she called her up on video Facebook Messenger right on the spot. And she was farming and packing produce, and she somehow got her to agree to have me to come over. And so the whole thing about building trust, that's something, we learned about in journalism school, and it always sounded weird to me, kind of like, oh, I'm building trust. But I found out that, like, you can be as intentional as you want, but it really came down to time. So even if I didn't think I had time, I spent that time. So I canceled whatever plans I had in Seoul. Um, and then I went down. It took a really long time to get there, and it was like this beautiful day visually. And I didn't. It did kind of flit across my mind. Oh, that would be great if I could have captured this, if I could have been more prepared. But it wasn't about that. I was just trying to not assume that I could just waltz into these people's lives, and they agreed to meet me. That's about all I knew. So what happened was, I went there and I hung out, and there are all these moments that I wish could have been filmed and everything. But ultimately, I thought I would be able to go back to Seoul that night, and they all knew differently already. So they arranged for this woman, Faye, who's also who opens up the video, for me to stay at her house. And what happened was, we ended up just walking through these like paths of the rice fields and just talked about everything. And by then, we had basically almost become friends. And so when we returned for filming and I got a crew together, I was lucky to find two really amazing cinematographers in Korea. And she let us all stay in her house. So I slept in her son's room with her and her son, and then her, like, 10-year-old son, and then the two guys slept in the guest bedroom. So that's how much access we got basically into the lives. So I'll move on. Okay, I was asked about, like, big issues in Korea today. This probably won't surprise anyone really, but the depopulation seemed like the most raw, basic one to me. But there are a lot of other ones that are very universal in a way. But as for environment, Korea has the ocean on all three sides. Storms have been intensifying, as they have in the Philippines and other island nations or places near the ocean. Infrastructure, kind of like, things happen where there was a rainstorm a month ago and 50 people died when waters they just died all at once under an overpass. Geopolitical stuff, North Korea, China, Russia. Inequalities widening, because at first the whole thing was, oh, everyone was at zero because it was the end of the war. But now the gaps are starting to get bigger. Rising costs, food inflation, unaffordable housing, things like that. And then an aging majority, because there are so few children. who are being born, and people are living longer and longer, it's becoming, out of balance. And then finally, mental health issues, because Korea not only comes from like a recent history of national level trauma, but they've also kind of like made a lot of sacrifices. They've sacrificed things like mental health or human rights in the beginning, especially in order to like have this breakneck miraculous economic development. And I mean, the cracks are starting to show. Like lately there have been a lot of, I mean, luckily they don't have a gun problem in Korea. There isn't a lot of gun access, but there have been these like copycat crimes of knifings, just random knifings of people running into crowded areas. And and a lot of it is also being really technologically advanced and just going from like a traditional agrarian society to being like leaders of a digital life and just being 24/7 gaming and living it with social media distortion. So those are some of the issues. And given these issues, the question was kind of like, what did it mean to be Korean? And so I was kind of thinking, what do I observe Korean people to see as kind of requirements to be considered Korean? Because I'm Korean, but I was born in the States. So I was thinking, what is it? And there are these historical ideas of purity and homogeneity. And one thing I do want to say is I've seen this a lot of American or other Western transposition of our racial dynamics, and also saying, oh, it's because of Confucianism, it's because of patriarchy, and it's because of the inherently Asian, assimilative, conformist society. And it's not untrue. There are truths to that, but it's also that for a long time, Korea was homogeneous, but they're constantly being invaded from all sides, always, like China and Mongolia, Japan. And then in recent history, I think we all know what happened, being colonized, and then split in half. And so for a while, that's how it's not really justification for racism and discrimination and xenophobia, but it's just sort of like the historical context for it. And so that's kind of like the history of things. And now, I mean, I feel like as of late, it's been more being a winner. There's like this never again mentality. Like never again will we be colonized. Never again will we be behind, and like this undeveloped nation that's war torn. And it really drives a lot of things. Like people are expected to be really successful, to work hard, to look good doing it, to never sleep and never show weakness. And that's something people are proud of. And just sort of, yeah, like if you want to be adopted as a Korean person, you can't be like a loser or a loaf. And what I wanted to say about that though is that yeah, as to the film, I think the characters of the film, the reason I brought up these three buckets here is because I think the characters in the film happen to either actually fulfill these characteristics or challenge their importance, right? And so with the pureness and homogeneity, I think that like if a Korean person were watching this film, I would hope they would just be like, oh, this child is half Filipino but looks Korean, or this child looks Filipino but sounds Korean and is Korean, and just have that be sort of disrupted. And then as for being like a winner, they're very successful. Everything from the farm to the son of, we didn't get to that part in the film, but Mary Lou, the farmer's son, was talking about how he's won all these awards for the engineering and operations of drones and wants to go into the military. And rather than saying, hey, this proves that they're worthy of being considered Korean, I think the complexity of them and their contributions just sort of stand on their own and disrupt this maybe a tendency to other people from other places, I'm hoping. And then finally, there's this wanting to be Korean. So Korea's just become really popular globally. And it seems almost like if there's that fever to learn the history, learn the language, and just sort of take on these characteristics, then that's opening a window to being welcomed as a Korean now, especially since the population is decreasing. And now Mary Lou and Faye and their families didn't necessarily seem like pro-nationalistic or anything, but I think they just sort of shine through as established Korean people just living their lives. And that's another way that I think the film addresses this. And then redefinition, that was sort of like my original language. It was a little naive, I think, after I actually worked with and talked with people who had migrated to Korea, because I don't think that redefinition is anything that can actually be just like handed down by any person or group or entity. And even if it were, I don't know if that would lead to the longevity of the Korean people. So it's just the usual evolution of hearts and minds. So going beyond just tolerance or feeling like people should tolerate or help these poor immigrants, but just actually seeing them as fellow Koreans, and then policies and systems actually being set up so that they are inclusive, in fact, of immigrants as Korean people. So the film tackled more of the hearts and minds stuff, and that's because I think that for the audience, constituents who vote on policies and systems and keep on top of them would have to have their perspective switched around a little bit to be supportive of that. Excuse me. Takeaways. There's so many takeaways that I had, and specifically for this, I remember Dr. Jean Franco, who is the professor who specializes in Filipino migration to Korea. She said, you know what, marriage migration is labor migration. And I never even thought about that. But I think that it's very gendered, actually. Like labor migration is considered like laborers and men. And someone might say, oh, well, women can be laborers too, but it's almost like they're these workers and men, and then there are women who go and like marry into some better life or something. But what I saw was not only is raising children a work, but also these women were like actually also laborers in the physical sense too, or at least Mary Lou was on the farm. And another thing is like AAPI, or if I take the A out of it, Asian and Pacific Islander issues are global issues with global audiences. And for me, that was something I felt more viscerally, because I could sit here and say like, oh, Asian people are the largest population, or Asian countries border the Pacific and touch America, or I could say all these things, but that was the first time being there that I viscerally felt kind of like, wow, in the US, I'm a part of not even 7% of kind of this group that's lumped together with good intentions, but just sort of, it just made me see that there's a big connection between things that are happening globally and then the populations who come and immigrate to the States. And I also realized that in the States, it's all about just kind of like people trying to come to America and people trying to be seen as American. And it just barely occurred to me to look beyond that before, until I stumbled upon this really interesting path to look at migration between different countries, or, you know, so there's that. And then in regard to underreported stories, additional reporting, foreign language skills really, really matter. And sure, you can have a translator, or, and it sounds like a huge barrier, but I say it more of as an encouragement, like if somebody has any foreign language skill at all, to try to leverage it or try to learn just a little bit, because it's a huge part of building trust and just like understanding nuances. I was so lucky that I could speak Korean and English, and they could speak Filipino dialects and English and Korean. And so it really was a part of the access of this. like knowing 2 of the 3 languages they know really helped to sew this together. And I'm not sure if I could have accessed that before. And that's when I was like, oh, I want to, beef up my Korean. I'd like to learn Filipino and just keep deepening those skills so that I can continue to find stories that might be harder with only one language. Working with locals is a thing to do, and Eastern Standard Times media is set up that way, but it's helps to check and balance like my own biases. And I'll get to like a little thing about that later. Um, and then looking at multiple generations helped to document this really fast change, or document and exhibit change that's just like whizzing by within one generation. And so that's something that I'd like to keep in mind, to like always try to sew together the timeline. And then, of course, remembering history. One example that pertains directly to the topic is that so one narrative, or like one refrain I've heard so many times is, oh, people aren't having children in Korea because it's so expensive to raise children. But every time I hear that, I'm sure that's true, and people have said that, like sources have been quoted actually saying that. But then I think, but what about all the other countries where it's so expensive to live, or people are so poor, and it's not necessarily stopping people from having kids? And to say nothing of like trauma or things like that, or gender roles and lack of support for women and all of these things. There was a policy by a dictator who was put in place when Korea still hadn't established a real democracy. And he was the one who had like all these economic plans. And so one of the biggest policies was kind of like a one-child policy to reduce children and to have fewer mouths to feed. And that also went hand in hand with like the exportation of children, or sending of children overseas for adoption at a really high rate. And so that's just one way that history is an important part of the context of the present. And journalism on the whole, takeaways was, if I hadn't been led to this area that was super remote with a very small community, just because so few people live there, that's basically a news desert. And it actually changed my kind of my aspirations, really, right? Because I went into journalism school thinking, oh, I'd like to write narrative stories for it. It doesn't mean I don't still want to do that, but for my day-to-day 9 to 5, I thought I am really supportive of local news outlets, and I want to go and serve, be like a public servant in a community that just doesn't have a lot of news or people watching what's going on. So that's like the ultimate invisibility, right? So it actually led to my applying only to local news jobs, which is why I'm going to be a local news fellow for the state of California. And oh, don't disregard citizen journalism or social media, because it's ultimately up to the individual, and to filter out what's real and to cross-reference things. And social media, a lot of Filipinos are on Facebook, and there's a saying that like if every Filipino person is on Facebook, or if not, they're signing up right now. But it really helped to contact people through social media, and then use the platform to chat or call or video chat. And so I just say that because I used to be like very averse to it and dismissive, and people would say you need to have it, and I was just so against it. So I had to kind of crack my head back open to do that. But also remembering not everyone else is online. Not everyone is online. And in future reporting trips, I want to make sure to remember that and deliberately look for people who I just can't find on social media. And then, okay, this is almost another section, but read the comments of people on the video, because this video actually went viral. I think I did say that like 2 million people watched it in this March. So it was released last November, and then suddenly the families in that village started writing to me, and they were just like, oh my gosh, the video went viral, and mostly in the Philippines. There's so many comments, hundreds. And I was just reading them, and some of them were just like unconditional compliments. Others were talking about side topics. And there was one that was just like, no, absolutely not. Like in the 1960s, the government was not supporting. So she was taking issue with like a caption. And at first I thought, oh, not what a troll, but I kind of like looked past it, but it bothered me, of course. And then I realized, why did it say in the video 1960s? This is like the worst thing that ever happened. I spent hours, if I even Googled, did a cursory search, when did marriage migration start in Korea? The leading hit became 1960s because of my project. And so this is what happened, that when I read something that said that in the 1960s, women fled from the rural areas. Korean women fled from the rural areas. And so there were a lot of bachelors. And then that created like a demand for women who would move to rural areas. But somehow in there, I made a leap from the 1960s to what it really started happening in the 90s. This is like hugely embarrassing and disturbing. And what I had to own the mistake and say, and nobody was there to like catch me and say, hey. And a big part of that was because I thought, how could I have done this? Like, how could I have, if I had a grip on Korean history, if I had learned it and internalized it and knew that historical context, it'd be easy to be like, well, at that time, there was the dictator who had the one-child policy, and if anything, they were discouraging people from getting married at all. So it couldn't have been in the 1960s that marriage migration began. So I had to go and tell the Pulitzer Center and then tell the Eastern Standard Times media, and there was no good excuse for why I did that. It was, but that was an experience as well. And it was because I read the comments and took them seriously. And it would have been easy to just sort of like, if I hadn't looked again at that comment and just been like, wait a minute, this is wrong. It's so wrong. So yeah, reading the comments and staying in touch, facing the music, which means once I think you access sources for a project like this, it's both lives can change forever, and staying in touch is good for, doing maybe follow-up stories or finding new sources and keeping that access. But it's also kind of like not walking away from the effects of both good and bad of the reporting. So I actually went and visited the families again this year because I was in Korea, and we were so happy, having a great time, eating a bunch of food, like running around town. And then I went on a walk with Faye again on those same roads through the rice fields. And this time the weather was all different. It wasn't the fall weather. There were just bugs in my eyes. It was muggy. And she just started saying, why did you mention the Unification Church? Because I'm a Christian. And I told you that even if I met my husband at the Unification Church, that we didn't subscribe to the church. And she was really upset. And she said, I feel like the church has distanced itself from me. And there is nothing I could do. At first, I said, oh, it was historical context. No one will think it's you because the subtitles don't say that. And she was like, no one pays attention to that. Like, they see the footage. Right after her, there's stock footage of these mass weddings and things. And I also looked back at comments from the cinematographers who are Korean, and one of the men is like a devout Christian himself. And he said, I think people might make a leap from the way this footage is presented and think that link her with the church. And I just kind of overlooked it. And that to me was a big reckoning with my own hidden biases. And that hidden biases, I felt like it was fine to talk about this, basically a cult, and that was essential to put in there. But then I didn't mention her faith, which was a big part of her life. And so there's something about my evaluation of things, and facing the music just means like just realizing how this affects someone, and when you're looking them in the eye and they're like right next to you talking to you, you can't be on an email and being like, oh well, this is, oh I'm so sorry, you know. I was so uncomfortable and I felt so bad, and there's just like literally nothing I could do, and except this, which is like talk about how important that is as a takeaway, like living and learning, and then and just like feeling, sitting in that discomfort, because like imagine how uncomfortable she felt, you know, after sharing her story. And yeah, that'll affect how I approach things too, because she said, I thought this was about our personal lives, our daily lives, not about the church. And it seemed to her that I mixed it up, and or it was presented in a way that people would just make assumptions no matter what the subtitle said, or I could point to facts and things. So she was letting you know. And then the paradox of the long game. So when you keep in touch with someone, and I am realizing I'm gonna have to learn to navigate this, is that like if you become friends with somebody, at a certain point, I think you have to stop scooping them for stories, because then it feels almost like you're working for them or something. Or if you're working on a story, there's kind of like a boundary to how much of a friend you can be in a way. So that's another takeaway, kind of like, oh, these are the ethical issues that they're always talking about. And it really comes across, especially when you access people and you have to go deep and like be in their lives. And it's easy to feel a little muddled about it. So those are my many takeaways. For time, sorry. I hope I'm not. All right, curiosities. I don't have any.
Gia, I think we could maybe take maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, maybe max
Oh
5,
yeah,
and then I
sure.
want to at least hold 10 minutes for questions from the group.
Okay, definitely. So yeah, these are I didn't think I could make any predictions, but these are other questions that sort of came up for me as a result of this story. So kind of like, is Korea exploiting migrants? There's like a new program where people can come work for 5 months of the year, and it's the most grueling, it's seasonal work. And then if for 5 years they don't receive any complaints from their managers, they can receive a 10-year visa and then bring their families over. And it just makes me question, kind of like, is this really like an opportunity? Or it sounds, you know. And where do inequalities exist that you don't really see in the news? And it made me curious why not, which is that Filipino people have a very native grasp of English because of when the US took over the Philippines from Spain and established all the educational networks there. And so they have perfect English, grammatically, spelling, everything, but have a certain accent or pronunciation, and also don't look like an English speaker. And so Faye in the video might have taught some classes in the rural school or in Sunday schools, but she said that there's a high barrier to working in a public school. And so that was something interesting. Made me wonder, like looking at their kids, will the first and second generations of new Koreans ever just say, hey, wait a minute, how come I can speak Korean, but I can't speak to my own mother in Filipino? It's kind of like how people with immigrant parents are starting to say, how come I wasn't taught this language? I don't know. Yeah, I'm curious if and when that'll happen and what it'll look like in Korea versus America. And then there's a flip side of Korean men going down for business or English classes and then fathering children in the Philippines and just leaving them there. And that almost really got me off track of my project, because I thought, how can I do this and not do this on the other side of it? So that's something else that to look, these are things that you don't really, I have not seen them in the news a lot. Oh yeah, this is, I'll just leave that for people to read. Connection between this story and American issues, yes. And yeah, basically the US formed Korean government, culture, economy, everything kind of trickled down from in the US's form, like when they took guardianship over Korea. And so as Americans, I think we should be looking at kind of like, how does this mirror us? How is it different? And those are instructive things. And then, you know, US interest in Korean pop culture is leading to more of that mirroring effect where people go beyond pop culture and they're inadvertently learning about history and things. So that's all I'll say about that. And then local from afar, these are these are just ideas, but especially I would say going out of the way to read news that are from other sources, like from other countries' perspectives, but then, you know, really taking advantage of technology. And perhaps you all do this anyway, but people can just make films off their iPhone and they can meet people, cold message somebody on Facebook and just do a project together. Why not? And then in doing the project, there would be a lot of learning, I think, on both sides about just kind of like how life is and how people conceive of news and issues like migration and identity. So that's it.
I loved all the slides that you made, like in ways that you created connections for us. Because something we're talking about in this room is really like asking the right questions and how to ask the right questions. And I really appreciate that you did that. So thank you so much for taking that time. I want to pass the floor on. Abby is going to walk around with the mic. And if you have a question, just raise your hand. And this is the time to ask Gia.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I like definitely I will watch the movie. So like last year I watched a movie, it's called Bashinko. I don't know if you watch it in Apple TV, and it's talking about the so history lesson. I never know that Japan occupied Korea. So it was about the Korean and how the Korean immigrant to Japan, and it was and how the Korean were treated in Japan, and it was very sad story. So I teach Arabic at Limblu, my school in Chicago, and one of my friends there, he teach English and he's Korean, and I told him, and he told me that his grandmother is from the same village. And when he start talking about it, he started crying. So it was amazing, actually. So thank you for your, like, I don't have any question, but I want to talk about, like, we need to search of these, like, know our, like, the history of the world, see these stories and show it to our students. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hi, Gia. This is Bara. I teach microbiology here in a college in Chicago. The question that comes to me, so it's really a big surprise. This is a story that I don't see in the outlets ever. It seems, I don't know, the human mind has a lot of evil to create. The question is, so this is Korea, Philippines. Did you, through your research, did you see a similar marriage migration in the world other than those two countries?
Definitely. Actually, the biggest groups are probably Chinese and Vietnamese. But my access happened to be Filipino, and I went in that route. But then I thought, like, there are definitely other groups. So this is just one of the angles of what's happening in Korea. The composition of Korea is changing quietly in places where people don't really know. So they might say, oh yeah, lots of people are coming and marrying, but they don't really see like how Korea really is changing and the lives of the people who have moved here and created families and now have a couple of generations even of people who've been here living as Koreans. So yeah.
Another question. Final question. I have, in fact, a lot of questions, but I will not take a lot of time. I don't see in the story any mentioning of, it is marriage migration. I don't see any story about the children.
the children did come out in the end of the video, or they come out later in the video. Yeah. It was really important for me to show them, to hear from them.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me okay? Hi. So nice to meet you. I know we were on email and everything. I'm Abby. Actually, to follow up on that question about the children, I know that they were in the latter part of the video, and they actually made some comment, and you made some point about them feeling like the other, and that there was a difference in treatment sometimes. So I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about how the children are. I mean, I found it fascinating to see this, like you talked about the success and how this you could see that the student was so proud of all that he had done, and he was very, he spoke but he did make, I think, a reference, or I can't remember if it was he specifically or if it was brought up in the story, about there still is that. And I don't know what that might look like for the families, or what it might look like for the children. I don't know if that's something to talk about.
Yeah, I can't completely speak for them. I didn't get to really go there with them and really like probe that. But one thing is, I know the father talked about how they would get teased, and then just sort of like they had a hard time, and then he would just say, buck up, and the mother said, yeah, but my kids are smart, and then it just cuts him. It reminds me a lot about, and maybe others could also empathize, or this will be similar to how some of us grew up before now, basically in America, where you just really subscribe to like, oh, just shrug it off, like nothing's really holding me back, and if you acknowledge it, that's not gonna, and you just want to be like the best that you can be, and you don't want to leave any room for criticism. You want to be all right with everybody and be a well-rounded American, and the barrier to doing that is, and I think that's why one of my biggest questions going forward, and something to look out for, is sort of like, for Korea, immigration has been going on for a while, quietly, sort of undercovers, but the whole awareness of like identity issues in Korea that come from that. And so I'm thinking, like, will they, once they reach their 40s, or when they have kids, will it be kind of like how I'm talking now and saying, wait a minute, right? Like, I lived my whole life, like, why did I live my life without even realizing that I was actually really avoiding specializing in what seems to be my career destiny, right? Because I really thought it was not being a well-rounded American. And then meanwhile, you know what I mean? And so it did make me wonder. They seem like they sort of shrug it off, kind of like, and they're just Korean. But what it takes to do that, frankly, is kind of like, I can't speak for them. For me, like, it took self-denial that I didn't really understand I was doing. And in some ways that's a strength, because you go through life with this armor and just do what you have to do. But yeah, it makes me so curious to see how they'll be when they're adults, if they have kids of their own, or if Korea's society becomes more, even more diverse and tempestuous in their reckonings, like how that will look in a country that's not America, and especially where the groups are different, kind of like, that will be interesting.
Gia, thank you so much. I think that last note was one of the many things I found really compelling about what you're describing, or what you've talked about in your presentation, because I think I immediately identified as someone who, grew up with sort of like a dual identity, and always grappling with that, and understanding myself as Indian or South Asian and also American, and what does that look like, and still struggling with that. And I think a lot of our students have similar relationships with the places that their parents came from, or even they came from, or their grandparents came from, and what it means to be American, and what does that really look like. And even this part that you're talking about of how now, as more migrants come to Korea, how is that going to complicate Korean identity, and how does it connect to some of the challenges of navigating that identity in the past? I think that's such a rich place for connection. for us. Whereas we may be in a different space because we've had so many unique communities come into the States. I think we still struggle with that, Tuwali. And I see a lot of kids sort of embrace it in a way that I never did. And I'm always like a little envious of how open their conversations are, how they have words for things that I didn't have words for, how there's like an appreciation that I never felt because I didn't have a lot of other people of color. So I just want to thank you for that, because I feel like I really got that out of this presentation, and it's sort of bolstering that conversation I have with myself, right? As I deepen my understanding of how it's impacted me and how it will shift how I sort of exist in this role in the future. So thank you.
Thanks. And yeah, that's why I feel particularly honored to talk with educators who are, because I'm assuming your students are all Gen Z, and they're amazing. It's just the potential to just like have this new era of global awareness, and just like new journalism is just so big. I don't know if I'm just being idealistic, but I have a little bit of that idealism in me where I'm just like, oh, the younger generations are going to save us all. But like the way that their lexicon is completely different. And some people will roll their eyes, like people my age or Gen Xers, or they'll just be like, oh my God, like all this terminology. But it's something to, I feel that I learn from it, and it makes me, envious too. And I'm just kind of like, things must have changed, or they will, if they keep going this way. And yeah, the new media is coming. Like honestly, I think I'm just so proud that I placed this in a new media destination that was more specialized, because yeah, like everyone wants to write something for the New York Times or the New Yorker, you know what I mean? But in reality, like these little more specialized outlets are, I think, something really to look at.
Well, thank you so much, Gia. We're going to let you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. One more question. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was coming into the late question. I'm Samantha. Thank you for this. This is beautiful. And the question I have, if it's too personal, please, don't feel like you need to answer it, or I don't mean to be offensive in any way. But I was wondering, when you're in Korea working and living, do the native Koreans see you as Korean or as American, or do they kind of allow for that duality, that may or may not be seen with what you're calling the new Koreans?
Yeah, so I can speak Korean. So that kind of helps me to pass, but also outs me because I have an American accent in my Korean. And I'm thankful to my mother for teaching me Korean. But I remember once I heard my own voice, I think I was in the 4th grade, and I would just make fun tapes with my sister and like fake commercials, but I heard my own voice on the tape, and I was like, oh my God, I have a Korean accent, And I think subconsciously or consciously, I tried to correct it until it went the other way. Now I have an American accent. And so people they'll either be like, where are you from? But when they hear that I'm from the States, they'll just be like, oh, wow, your Korean's good. And for me, I think I fit into that like overtly wants to be Korean category where, I was born and raised in the States. I'm grateful for some things, but in the past years, just the way my life has gone, and how social dialogue has been in the States, I just feel kind of like, oh, I'm actually a Korean person who, because of so many events and forces greater than my choice or even my parents' choice, that I'm a Korean who was born in America, and people will say to me like, oh, you're so Korean. And they'll say that over things like food or behaviors, or, everything from drinking boisterously to like eating a strange thing that only Korean people would ever eat, like hagfish. It's like this horrible boneless eel type of thing. So I've been very accepted, and I think there is a lot of that. So the other stuff is true too, like it's highly discriminatory, it could be sick, all that stuff is true, but I think there is also like such a reception and an amazement among them too, kind of like, oh, people know us now, they care about us. And what, by the way, when I was in the Philippines, people in the Philippines also, they love Korean culture and everything. And I was kind of like, is this what it feels like to be, I don't know, Caucasian in Asia. You know what I mean? Like if I were to go, because I've never had that feeling before. And only by virtue of that was I kind of like, I've not necessarily been, I haven't felt, don't get me wrong, I haven't felt like unwelcome where I grew up in Massachusetts or anything. But like, it's the first time that I felt like revered just because of where I was from and who I am. And I definitely didn't have that in the States. So it's like such an interesting shift that's happening. And it's not just Korea, but other countries as well, other regions, things that like, and pop culture is actually no small thing. I think it shows where popularity is and just sort of like shows the strength of that. And again, outside the American framework. So
I can confirm there's a huge interest in Korean culture at our school where we teach. I would say, what is our student population is 90% Hispanic, and they just love Korean culture. A lot of kids are studying the language on Duolingo, and yeah.
and you know something else? Korean people love, and I can't speak for all Koreans, but they love other cultures. Like they still love America. They are into like Latin music, and just that's why I think there's so much potential for exchange. It doesn't have to just be with Korea and Philippines too. Like talk about the world's voyagers, or I don't know what else to say than that. That I feel like as a country, like Philippine people are the most far-flung people, right down to like how 70% of people traveling on the high seas who basically live without a nation and live on ships or work in the service industry on cruise ships are Filipino. So those are two countries like I happen to have worked with communities there, but I think it's just a great place to start to just almost randomly like try to do some exchanges with students there because they're equally interested and fascinated by other cultures. Yeah, that's what I've observed.
I also appreciated the thought that you mentioned that, you know, not everybody appreciates us shining the spotlight on the undiscovered news. And earlier we looked at our students, you know, reactions to the news, anxiety, depression. I think we need to be really mindful as educators on balancing what we introduce into the classroom. I'm always trying, you know, as a privileged white woman, I can come into the classroom and shine the spotlight on all these inequities in the world, but sometimes I can be doing more harm than good. And just tying that up to an experience I had earlier this summer in Mississippi. Sorry, I will be blabbing on about this, but speaking with community members there about there will be a new Emmett Till National Park. And to me, that sounds great, you know, shining the spotlight on that history that nobody wants to discuss still down there. But on the other hand, you know, for many community members, they're just like, can we shine the spotlight on the music culture down here? Or, and, you know, maybe many of our students do know about Emmett Till, but they don't know about something like the outstanding music culture. So just a reminder to keep that balance. I think it's really important. And just with my little film studies class that I'll be teaching this year, and I'll shut up. I don't want to show all doom and gloom movies. I do want every movie I show to be relevant, but I need to do some work here to find some films that highlight a positive news story.
Yeah, definitely. Like if I could just say the way that I meant to present it originally was kind of like, I believe that lately educators and workplaces are into like mass psychology, and they say positive reinforcement is a lot better than negative reinforcement or threats or, you know, the use of fear. And it's like this huge revolutionary thing. And I think with news too, there's sometimes like, I think people think that like the idea of advocacy journalism, the way people talk about that, it's almost like a derided, it's almost like a negative connotation. But I think it's, what else do people mean by saying elevating voices or representing the underrepresented? And I think there's a lot more power, there can be a lot more power to like highlighting things that people are even trying to do, and then just like the intrigue of that, like it makes you root for people, and it's something productive and endeavors that, for people to actually support, like that people need support and awareness around. So I'm all for the balancing of, yeah.
All right, Gia. Well,
Thank you.
we want to thank you so much for your time. I know how late it is there. Just
I'm
really
having a blast.
appreciate, your incredible presentation, the time you took to answer our questions, wishing you the best. And we're so excited, to follow your work, your future work, and your local reporting coming up. I'm just gonna, hopefully we can zoom out a little bit so you can see the team. But we just want to
Yeah.
wish you a very, very good night. And hope you have a great day, and then we can end it on Gia if you want to say anything to close out the session.
Oh yeah, no, just like thanks for being educators. It's not easy, and I'm curious how this is all gonna like come together too, like what you end up doing. So yeah, hopefully keep in touch. And I'm here. I put my information somewhere, but if you want to ask about anything or connecting with anybody, I'll be really happy to connect. So yeah, thanks for this opportunity. I just am really honored.